Always pray first. This is not a religious habit, not a routine phrase passed down through tradition, but a spiritual posture that decides who leads your life. When prayer becomes the first response instead of the last resort, everything changes. Before fear settles in, before logic overwhelms faith, before the mind runs ahead of the spirit, prayer places God at the center. Psalm 27 begins with a bold declaration that the Lord is our light and salvation, and that truth only becomes real when we approach God before approaching the problem. Prayer first means acknowledging that God sees what we cannot see and knows what we do not yet understand. Many people pray only after exhaustion, after disappointment, after confusion has already taken root. But praying first is an act of trust. It says, God, I believe you are already working even before I see evidence. Morning prayer invites God into the very beginning of our thoughts. It allows His light to shape our perspective before darkness tries to define the day. When prayer comes first, fear loses its power to dominate, because fear thrives where God's presence is ignored. The heart that prays first does not deny reality, but it refuses to let reality become greater than God. Psalm 27 reminds us that God is light, and light does not argue with darkness, it simply shows up. Prayer is how we turn toward that light. In the morning, when the mind is quiet and the soul is most open, prayer becomes alignment. It straightens what anxiety is twisted and steadies what uncertainty is shaken. Praying first is choosing to be led instead of dragged by circumstances. It is surrendering control before control turns into stress. When prayer is delayed, emotions often take charge. Anger speaks first, worry makes decisions, and fear sets expectations. But when prayer leads, emotions follow God's order. Prayer does not always change the situation immediately, but it always changes the position of the heart. A heart positioned in God's presence can face anything without collapsing. This is why Psalm 27 speaks of confidence even in the presence of enemies. That confidence is born in prayer, not in preparation alone. Praying first also trains the spirit to listen before reacting. Life constantly demands quick responses, but God invites thoughtful dependence. In prayer, we learn to pause, and that pause becomes powerful. It prevents us from speaking words we regret and choosing paths we were never meant to walk. When prayer comes first, wisdom rises naturally. God's guidance becomes clearer because the heart is not crowded with noise. There is a quiet strength in beginning the day with God. It does not always feel dramatic, but it is deeply transformative. Morning prayer builds inner resilience. It prepares the soul for resistance, disappointment, and unexpected turns. Psalm 27 speaks of confidence even when an army encamps nearby. That kind of confidence is not emotional optimism. It is spiritual grounding. It is the result of meeting God before meeting the world. Praying first is also an act of humility. It admits that human strength is limited and that self-reliance eventually leads to exhaustion. God never intended us to carry the weight of life alone. Prayer releases what we were never meant to hold. It places our worries into hands that do not shake. When prayer is first, peace follows naturally, not because everything is perfect, but because trust has taken root. Darkness often feels strongest in the early moments of uncertainty. That is why prayer must come first, especially in seasons of waiting. Psalm 27 speaks of waiting on the Lord with courage. Waiting becomes possible when prayer has already reminded the heart of who God is. Without prayer, waiting feels like delay. With prayer, waiting feels like preparation. God's light does not rush, but it never arrives late. To pray first is to declare that God's voice matters more than internal fear or external pressure. It is choosing divine direction over emotional impulse. Every morning prayer becomes a quiet rebellion against despair. It says, today, I will not be led by what I see, but by who God is. And that choice, repeated daily, reshapes the entire journey of faith. Trusting God's light when surrounded by uncertainty is one of the deepest acts of faith a person can make. Uncertainty is uncomfortable because it removes the illusion of control. It forces the heart to face questions without answers and paths without clarity. Yet Psalm 27 boldly declares that the Lord is our light, not just when things make sense, but especially when they do not. God's light is not dependent on our understanding. It exists before clarity arrives. To trust that light is to believe that God is present even when the way forward feels hidden. Uncertainty often speaks loudly in the mind. It brings fear, hesitation, and overthinking. It tells us to wait until everything is clear before we move, before we trust, before we hope. But God's light does not require full visibility to guide us. Light does not reveal the entire journey at once. It reveals the next step. Trusting God in uncertainty means walking forward with partial understanding but complete dependence. It is choosing faith over the demand for certainty. Psalm 27 was written from a place where danger and confusion were real, not imagined. Yet the confidence expressed is unwavering. This teaches us that trust is not the absence of fear, but the decision to believe God is greater than fear. When uncertainty surrounds us, God's light becomes a place of refuge. It reassures the heart that even if the destination is unclear, the guide is trustworthy. Trust grows when we stop asking God to explain everything and start believing that He sees everything. In uncertain seasons, the mind searches for signs, confirmations, and guarantees. But God often invites us to trust His character more than circumstances. His light is steady, even when our emotions fluctuate. It does not flicker with doubt or fade with delay. When we lean into God's light, we learn that uncertainty is not punishment, it is often preparation. God uses unclear moments to deepen dependence and refine faith. Trusting God's light also requires releasing the need to rush. Uncertainty tempts us to move quickly just to escape discomfort. But God's light teaches patience. It slows the heart and quiets the panic. In His presence, waiting becomes meaningful rather than empty. Psalm 27 speaks of confidence and courage while waiting, not after waiting ends. This shows us that trust is active, not passive. It is choosing to stand firm even when answers are delayed. Darkness does not mean God is absent. Often darkness is where His light becomes most visible. In uncertain moments, prayer becomes the connection to that light. Prayer does not always remove confusion instantly, but it anchors the soul. It reminds us that God's guidance is not limited by what we see. His light works in ways we cannot track but can trust. Trust grows through repeated surrender. Every time uncertainty arises and we choose to lean on God instead of fear, faith strengthens. Psalm 27 teaches that confidence is built in God's presence, not in predictable outcomes. The heart that trusts God's light learns to rest even when the future feels unstable. That rest is not denial, it is assurance rooted in who God is. Uncertainty also exposes where we place our security. When plans fall apart and expectations shift, God's light reveals whether our trust was in outcomes or in Him. Trusting God's light means believing that even detours are under His direction. What feels like delay may be protection. What feels like loss may be redirection. God's light sees the full picture, even when we only see fragments. There is strength in admitting that we do not know. Trust begins where pride ends. When we acknowledge uncertainty and still choose faith, God meets us with peace that surpasses understanding. Psalm 27 does not promise a life without trouble. It promises a God who remains steady within it. Trusting that promise changes how we walk through uncertainty. To trust God's light is to believe that clarity will come at the right time, not necessarily when we demand it. It is choosing hope when logic struggles. It is standing firm when answers are incomplete. And every time we trust God in uncertainty, we discover that His light was guiding us all along, even when we could not see it. Courage rising from God's presence, not circumstances, is a truth that reshapes how strength is understood. Many people believe courage comes when situations improve, when threats disappear, or when answers finally arrive. But Psalm 27 reveals a deeper reality. Courage is born in the presence of God, long before circumstances change. When the heart learns to dwell with God, fear loses its authority, even when conditions remain uncertain or difficult. Circumstances are unstable by nature. They shift without warning, bringing comfort one moment and pressure the next. If courage depends on circumstances, then courage will always be fragile. But when courage flows from God's presence, it becomes steady and resilient. Psalm 27 speaks of confidence even when enemies advance and trouble surrounds. This confidence is not rooted in self-confidence, but in God-awareness. The psalmist does not deny danger. He simply refuses to let danger define his response. God's presence creates a different internal environment. Fear may still knock, but it no longer rules. In God's presence, the heart is reminded of who God is, and that NCE fuels courage. Courage does not mean the absence of trembling, it means choosing to stand despite it. When the soul is anchored in God, courage becomes a decision rather than a reaction. It is the quiet strength that says, even here, God is with me. Many people wait for courage to appear before they act, but God often calls us to step forward while courage is still forming. His presence provides the assurance needed to move even when confidence feels incomplete. Psalm 27 shows that courage grows as we draw near to God. One moment in His presence can do more for the heart than endless attempts to control outcomes. God's nearness reminds us that we are not facing life alone. Courage rooted in God's presence is not loud or aggressive. It is calm, grounded, and steady. It does not need to prove itself or overpower others. It simply stands firm. This kind of courage is developed through prayer and trust, not through confrontation alone. When we spend time with God, our perspective shifts. Problems that once felt overwhelming begin to shrink in comparison to God's greatness. Fear thrives in isolation, but courage grows in communion with God. When the heart disconnects from God's presence, fear finds space to multiply. But when we remain close to God, fear is exposed for what it is, temporary and limited. Psalm 27 reminds us that God is our stronghold, a place of safety. A stronghold is not built in a moment. It is established through consistent trust and presence. Courage also grows when we learn to seek God's face rather than His hand. When the focus is only on outcomes, courage weakens if results delay. But when the focus is on God's presence, courage remains steady regardless of outcomes. Psalm 27 expresses a deep desire to dwell in the house of the Lord, not just to escape trouble, but to know God more deeply. That desire fuels courage because intimacy with God produces security. God's presence reframes challenges. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" the heart begins to ask, "What is God teaching me here?" That shift in perspective turns fear into growth. Courage becomes the willingness to trust God's purpose even when the path is unclear. This is not blind faith, it is relational faith, built on knowing God's character. Courage from God's presence also empowers endurance. It allows the heart to remain steady over time, not just in moments of crisis. Psalm 27 speaks of waiting on the Lord with strength. Waiting requires courage because it resists the urge to rush or panic. Courage says, "I will stand here and trust until God moves." That kind of courage cannot be manufactured, it is received in God's presence. Ultimately, courage that comes from God's presence outlasts fear because it is rooted in something eternal. Circumstances change, threats fade, and challenges pass, but God remains. When courage is anchored in Him, it becomes a constant companion rather than a fleeting emotion. And in that presence, the heart learns that no matter what surrounds it, it does not stand alone. Waiting on the Lord with confidence and patience is one of the most challenging disciplines of faith, especially in a world that values speed, instant results, and quick answers. Waiting often feels like weakness, like time wasted, or like God is silent. Yet, Psalm 27 invites the heart to wait on the Lord and be strong, revealing that waiting is not passive inactivity, but active trust. True waiting is filled with expectation, not despair, and it draws its strength from confidence in who God is, not from how quickly circumstances change. Impatience is usually born from fear. When outcomes are uncertain, the heart wants to move quickly to regain a sense of control. But waiting on the Lord requires surrendering that control. It is trusting that God's timing is purposeful and precise even when it feels uncomfortable. Confidence in waiting does not come from knowing when the answer will arrive, but from knowing that God is faithful while we wait. Psalm 27 teaches that courage is found in trusting God's process, not rushing ahead of His direction. Waiting exposes what we truly believe about God. If we believe He is good, then waiting becomes bearable. If we believe He is wise, then delay becomes meaningful. Confidence in waiting grows as we remember past faithfulness. Every moment God has guided, protected, or provided becomes evidence that He will do so again. Patience is strengthened when memory and faith work together. reminding the heart that God has never failed, even when his timing felt slow. In waiting, God often works internally before he works externally. While the situation may look unchanged, the heart is being refined. Waiting builds endurance, humility, and deeper trust. It teaches the soul to rely on God rather than outcomes. Psalm 27 reflects this internal work by showing a heart that remains steady despite external threats. This steadiness is the fruit of waiting in God's presence, not the result of favorable conditions. Confidence while waiting also comes from understanding that God sees what we cannot. He knows the full picture, including dangers we are unaware of and blessings we are not yet ready to receive. What feels like delay may be protection, and what feels like silence may be preparation. Waiting on the Lord means trusting his perspective over our limited understanding. It is choosing faith when logic runs out. Patience in waiting does not mean suppressing emotions. The Bible does not ask us to ignore frustration or longing. Instead, it invites us to bring those emotions to God. Waiting becomes healthier when it is accompanied by prayer. Prayer keeps the heart connected to God's presence, preventing bitterness from taking root. In prayer, patience is renewed because the soul is reminded that it is seen, heard, and loved by God. Waiting with confidence also reshapes how time is viewed. Instead of seeing waiting as lost time, faith begins to see it as sacred time. These moments become opportunities for growth, reflection, and deeper intimacy with God. Psalm 27 expresses a desire to dwell in the Lord's presence, showing that waiting is not merely about reaching an outcome, but about remaining close to God throughout the process. One of the greatest tests of waiting is resisting comparison. Watching others move forward while we remain still can create doubt and discouragement. But waiting on the Lord requires focusing on God's plan rather than another person's pace. Confidence grows when we trust that God's timing for us is intentional and personal. What is delayed is not denied, it is being aligned. Waiting also strengthens spiritual maturity. It teaches discernment, helping us recognize when to move and when to remain still. Those who learn to wait well are often better prepared for what comes next. God uses waiting to develop character that can sustain future blessings. Without patience, even good outcomes can become overwhelming. Ultimately, waiting on the Lord with confidence and patience is an act of worship. It declares that God is worthy of trust, even when answers are not immediate. It is choosing to remain faithful in the in-between, believing that God is working even when we cannot see it. And in that waiting, the heart grows stronger, quieter, and more anchored in God than ever before. Morning prayer as spiritual alignment for the entire day is one of the most powerful, yet often overlooked disciplines of faith. The way a day begins quietly determines how it unfolds loudly. When the first moments are surrendered to God, the heart is positioned correctly before demands, distractions, and pressures arrive. Psalm 27 reminds us that the Lord is our light, and morning prayer is hope. We intentionally turn our face toward that light before shadows attempt to follow us throughout the day. Morning prayer is alignment because it brings the inner life into order. Sleep may rest the body, but the soul still needs direction. Thoughts wake up quickly, worries try to take the lead, and plans begin forming almost immediately. Prayer steps in and establishes God's authority over those thoughts. It says, "Lord, you lead today. Not my fear, not my schedule, not my emotions." This act of surrender does not weaken a person. It strengthens them by removing the burden of self-direction. When prayer begins the day, perspective is adjusted. Situations that might later feel overwhelming are seen through the lens of God's presence. Psalm 27 speaks of confidence in the midst of trouble, and that confidence is often built before trouble ever appears. Morning prayer prepares the heart in advance. It equips the soul with peace that can be carried into conflict, clarity that can withstand confusion, and patience that can outlast frustration. Alignment through morning prayer also sharpens spiritual awareness. Throughout the day, choices must be made, words must be spoken, and reactions must be controlled. Prayer sensitizes the heart to God's guidance. It helps us recognize when to speak and when to remain silent, when to move forward and when to pause. Without prayer, reactions are often impulsive. With prayer, responses become intentional and rooted in wisdom. Morning prayer does not eliminate challenges, but it changes how they are faced. Instead of reacting from stress, the heart responds from trust. Psalm 27 declares God as a stronghold, and prayer is how we enter that stronghold before stepping into the world. When the heart is anchored early, it is less likely to be shaken later. The peace gained in prayer becomes a shield against chaos. Spiritual alignment also brings emotional stability. Many emotional struggles intensify when the heart feels disconnected from God. Morning prayer reconnects that relationship daily. It reminds the soul that it is not alone and not forgotten. This reassurance carries through conversations, tasks, and unexpected moments. Even when pressure builds, there is an underlying calm that comes from having already been with God. Morning prayer also aligns priorities. It helps distinguish between what is urgent and what is important. In God's presence, distractions lose their power and purpose becomes clearer. Psalm 27 expresses a desire to dwell in the Lord's presence, showing that intimacy with God shapes desire. When prayer comes first, the heart becomes less driven by external validation and more guided by internal conviction. Consistency in morning prayer builds spiritual strength over time. It is not about long or perfect prayers, but about faithful connection. Each morning spent with God layers stability into the soul. Over time, this practice creates resilience. Challenges still come, but why meet a heart that is prepared rather than panicked? Morning prayer is also an act of trust. It acknowledges that the day ahead is unknown, but God is known. It places confidence not in plans, but in God's faithfulness. Psalm 27 reminds us that God's light goes before us, and prayer is how we step into that light willingly when the day begins. With prayer, God's presence does not stay behind in the quiet moments. It walks with us into work, relationships, decisions, and difficulties. Alignment does not mean perfection, it means direction. And a day directed by God, even when imperfect, remains grounded in peace, guided by wisdom, and covered in His light.